So let's get into it. I think this group is very familiar with the Level 1 project. Historically, or at least initially, the project was focused on supporting digital payment needs of low-income end users, largely in the domestic context, with those needs of end users being usefulness, convenience, and affordability. Of course, helping countries solve for those payments needs inside the borders was a starting point, and quickly there was a recognition that those needs of low-income end users very much include cross-border transfers, and that's across all of the use cases. That is not just limited to the P2P use case, but also merchant payments and cross-border trade payments. So, as is the case with domestic payment needs, the essence of the L1P project is that instant payment systems, when designed deliberately from the start to be inclusive, can deliver on cross-border payments that are useful, convenient, and affordable. There are three really foundational elements that are critical to executing on that vision. Think of these as really the starting point or the orientation. And as we dive into the specific principles, practices, and guidance, you'll hopefully see these three elements of the vision reflected in that guidance, which will provide a bit more of the how. But this is really the starting perspective or the starting orientation. And so let's name these. We're not going to, again, linger on them as you'll hopefully see them reflected in that guidance. First, it's really important for the inclusive instant payment scheme to develop all of the foundational, technical, and institutional basis for any scheme participant who is connected to a domestic scheme to then be able to conduct cross-border payments, ultimately with minimal additional effort. Once they are connected to the domestic scheme, the foundation should be there in place for them to be able to conduct cross-border payments. The other key element of that vision is that multilateral interlinking between domestic schemes is really foundational for enabling inclusive cross-border payments. We do see instances of bilateral linking on a scheme-by-scheme basis. The ability to scale those bilateral links ultimately becomes more costly and can produce a less than ideal user experience as additional schemes and linkages are added. So starting from that premise of the goal is multilateral linking and the ability to have multiple domestic payment systems connect under a single set of rules is quite foundational. This last point is certainly not exclusive to cross-border payments, but becomes even more important in a cross-border payment context. And that is that there's an essential role for central banks to play in achieving inclusive cross-border payments. When you're dealing with multiple jurisdictions, alignment and harmonization on regulations, on objectives that may differ from a jurisdiction to another jurisdiction, that becomes more complicated in terms of alignment. And so having a commitment of central banks and involvement of central banks in setting guidance for the cross-border arrangement it becomes particularly important. So let's go to the next slide here. Let's take a step back a little bit. Why are we still here? Why are we talking about cross-border payments? We note affordability as a key end user need and one that ultimately becomes even more challenging in a cross-border context. There have been, many of you I'm sure, are following closely. There have been coordinated, concerted efforts underway to improve cross-border payments that go beyond cost, but cost becomes a really critical component of those. And those efforts are focused on different types of payments, both low value and high value. Many of the efforts from a cost perspective do put additional focus or particular focus on low value, given that the costs are still quite high in this space. The probably the most prominent effort in this space to address cost and other challenges to cross-border payments is the G20 roadmap that's dedicated to improving a number of these challenges. One of the more prominent goals from an affordability perspective are to reduce the transaction cost, the average transaction cost of cross-border payments and remittances specifically, to be no more than 3% by 2030, with no corridors with costs higher than 5%. We're not quite there yet. Challenges certainly remain. Progress has been made. There have been reductions in cost in certain corridors and by certain providers, but there is certainly lots more opportunity and need to reduce the cost. Currently, transaction fees, the global average of sending a remittance is around 6.6%. So we're still, quite far from that goal. I will note that digital remittances do have a lower cost than non-digital ones. There are a number of additional elements that make cross-border payments more expensive and contributed to that lack of affordability. One of those includes exchange rate markups. So there are different components to the cost. There are potential fees as well as the foreign exchange transactions, which may include a markup on the exchange rate. There may be additional fees that are tacked on or part of the transaction value of the transaction being deducted along the journey of the transaction, in particular if there are additional or multiple DFSPs involved, so that it takes part of the value out of the transaction. Limited liquidity, certainly in the context within that we're largely focused on, there are currencies that have lower supply, less liquidity, that contributes to those FX transactions and the markups being even higher. And double conversion as a result of limited liquidity in certain currencies, there's a tendency to move towards to use a third currency that is more liquid, or sometimes referred to as a hard currency, like a dollar or a euro, which then adds additional steps into the process and adds additional cost into the overall transaction. And so these are all elements that we are hoping to and looking to support and addressing through some of the guidance that we have come out with that are intended to lower or increase affordability for end users. Here, I want to just introduce you to the frame that we will ultimately be using as we dive into the guidance. So you are familiar with L1P principles and L1P practices and guidance. As part of this work, we have refined these further and organized these into a clear framework where we have 7 principles, and each of those is supported by practices and guidance. Now, of course, the intent of an L1P aligned system, the goal is that it will implement all of these principles and practices and guidance. This is really a package deal. What we have done from a cross-border payments perspective is apply the cross-border lens. And what is it that we mean by that? There are a number of these principles, practices, and guidance that really take or require additional focus or emphasis, potentially reflective of complexities, additional complexities that are involved in making cross-border payments. And so these are part of this cross-border lens. So when we talk about the guidance here and the practices, you'll see a subset of the full set of L1P principles and L1P practices. Couple of points that I want to make here, and one that's particularly important is that this guidance that we'll talk through at this stage is largely aspirational. We don't see at this stage a cross-border payment system that has implemented all of these. The intent is to advocate and push the market further in order to address these. And so while in the report itself, we have identified a number of market illustrations that that provide examples of how this guidance may be implemented. Those are kind of one-off for each of the practices, and so you'll see that in the report. The other element that I want to highlight here, for organizational purposes, we have slotted and categorized the guidance within specific principles and practices, but we fully recognize that some of the guidance, is very much relevant across more than one practice or more than one principle. So we've used it as an organizing frame here. And here I won't spend time going through the list of the guidance under the cross-border lens, but really just want to introduce you to the set of principles and practices that are part of that lens. And let me just quickly name the principles, and that is instant payment, interoperability, inclusive governance, low fees for end users, safe payments, and shared capabilities. And those will become clearer as we dive into each of those practices. Okay, let's dive right into it. So I will cover the first, and I can't see the time, so I want to make sure I'm staying on track here. And Elizabeth, I'll have you maybe wave at me.
We have 30 minutes to complete.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, so let's get into this. This will be somewhat scratching the surface, but again, the intent is that hopefully we get you excited to see much more detail that is included in the report. So I will cover the first couple of principles, and that is instant payment and interoperability. And then Elizabeth will take it from here to cover the remaining ones. So here, and to orient you to how this slide is structured, on the top you'll see the principal name. On the left here, you'll see the practice. So right now we're in the instant payment principle, and then the near real-time settlement practice. Of course, near real-time settlement is something we have advocated for as part of L1P overall. In the cross-border context, there are certain complexities, additional considerations that are worthy of acknowledging and providing specific guidance to guide implementation. Some of those complexities include as we mentioned, the conversion of domestic currencies into foreign currencies, and the settlement of those foreign currency transactions. Again, depending on the specific currencies, low liquidity of that currency can contribute potentially to delays and certainly to higher cost, in particular if we're in the case of double conversion. And also the systems that are used for settlement, which in most cases for instant payments are RTGS, often don't function on a 24/7 basis. And so there's also a complexity around timing. And so these complexities lead to increased risk of delay and higher costs that require a concerted effort and additional steps than what's needed in domestic context. So the two pieces of guidance here from a settlement perspective that we have identified. One is that only settling an obligation in one currency if the settlement of the other currency also takes place at the same time. So this practice is referred to as payment versus payment. And the intent here is to, again, address that settlement risk that is present and heightened in a cross-border context. And the second, getting straight into the double conversion challenge, is to avoid costs that are introduced by converting into a third or intermediate currency. Now, there's an acknowledgement that these are not easy to implement, but these are aspirational. And there are, again, in the report, we go into more detail around potential ways to move towards achieving this guidance. So the next couple of slides here are on the interoperable principle. And the two components here are modern technical architecture and data readiness. So and maybe let me name the practice itself here. So from the overall L1P practice, this talks about the platform providing really key functionalities for the ability of a transaction to be made end-to-end, to be interoperable. And that includes switching, which is the core functionality, as well as fraud mitigation, fraud detection, and other functionalities like addressing. From a cross-border perspective, once again, there are additional complexities, considerations that are introduced. We mentioned in the vision, the starting vision for implementing cross-border L1P in the cross-border context is to design from the start for multilateral interlinking. And in order for this to happen, the guidance and the foundational elements of the guidance, like messaging formats and operating protocols, need to be there in place in order to support the cross-border use case, which potentially includes additional types of data and information. And when we're in the context of being in different jurisdictions, aligning on those and harmonizing on those messaging formats through a single harmonized set of rules for the cross-border scheme becomes particularly important. And of course, providing all needed functionalities. So there are additional considerations for cross-border payments, certainly sanctions screening is one. Fraud mitigation becomes even more complex in this context. And all of those functionalities need to be supported by the platform. And the other element very much related to this, is data readiness. So naming the practice itself, overall L1P practice, the guidance here is that the data should be structured using ISO 20002 and designed to support all use case needs. Also giving consideration for minimizing the passage of PII information by the platform. One study I want to mention here that estimates that about 14% of cross-border payments fail. And as part of that, also have additional costs associated with them. And so opportunities to minimize that failure through ensuring that any national differences in protocols and messaging are aligned on and harmonized becomes really particularly important to minimize some of those failures. And let's see if there's anything else here. Right. So, and maybe a prominent example here to show where alignment is particularly important is payment addressing. There are differences in how domestic jurisdictions, how they may support different addressing types. There may be a need for information on the purpose of transactions to support balance of payments, data collection. So additional elements that need to be considered in the cross-border payment context. Okay, I will pause here. I know I'm speaking a mile a minute. We really do want to expose you to some of this and hopefully have an opportunity still at the end to have some questions and a discussion. Elizabeth, can I turn it over to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move on to the next principle. And that one is inclusive governance. And within that, we wanted to focus on the aspects of regulation and supervision that are, perhaps most relevant for cross-border payments. And it may seem very obvious that the guidance would be to have an appropriate oversight mechanism for the cross-border payments. But on another level, it's not necessarily intuitive in that, you already have one for your domestic payments. But now we're in a multi-jurisdictional context, right? That's our big implication when we move into cross-border. So all aspects of the domestic oversight mechanism may not be fully relevant for the cross-border one. So you have to talk with the counterparties and define what those would be in the cross-border context. So here is another one where it's not just the scheme or it's not just the DFSPs. We have to have active collaboration with the regulator and by the regulator to make the cross-border context work. So let's go on. There's another set for inclusive governance, and that is, of course, inclusive scheme rules, which is a key aspect of the level one principles or the level one project, right? We need to engage all eligible DFSPs within the scheme in rulemaking and in future enhancements and planning. And so that means that we need to do that in the cross-border context as well as the domestic scheme. Let me focus on the second one first, because that's a little bit similar to the guidance that we just spoke about. We need to ensure in cross-border scheme, we also encourage participatory rulemaking. So all the goodness that we have brought into domestic payments needs to be applied in the cross-border scheme rulemaking. And then one that might be a little bit controversial to some is that we need to ensure in that rulemaking and that we have the end users' needs in mind here too, not only the DFSPs in the scheme. Right. So one of those important rules that we think needs to be incorporated is that we need to ensure that foreign exchange rates are advantageous for the end user. That doesn't mean that there's not going to be any profit margin for the DFSP or the FX provider, but it means that we're not in the business in this inclusive cross-border scheme of gouging the consumers, whether they be businesses or users, or whether they be business or individual consumers. So, we need to find some guidance that helps or ensures, honestly, that the DFSP picks a foreign exchange rate that is beneficial to the end user, not simply to the DFSP itself. And if we don't do that, we're not going to have any end users using our service here. So it's as important as any other potential rule we could have. Let's keep going, Joanna. Thanks. So One of our principles in the level 1 project is to ensure low fees for end users. That is a ultra important goal. And of course, all the things that you're doing here are about, in Mojaloop and Tazama for that matter, are about how do we make that happen? How can we make sure those fees are low to the end user? Well, we have to keep the costs low to the DFSPs as well. So just as in a domestic scheme, it's ultra important that this focus be applied for the cross-border activities, and that we need to make sure that the DFSP itself is not incurring a lot of costs that it cannot recover in applying low fees to the end users. So this is not only the fee, transaction fee in our mind, but also the foreign exchange rate, which, foreign exchange is ultimately a necessary fee where currencies need to be converted. But we need to keep that cost of that fee as low as possible. Let's go to the next one. All right. So here's where things are going to get really, I think, new and interesting because safe payments, how we go about making payments secure and, of course, understood so people know what they're buying, what they're transacting. And we have a practice that is now being called transparent terms. We did not explicitly mention transparent terms previously. We're bringing that terminology into the level 1 because I think we realized it was an oversight because this was being catered for, but it hadn't been, if you will, given a real name here. And we wanted to make sure that this came out in the cross-border context. Of course, it's important for domestic, even more so in the cross-border environment. So what do we mean in this case? In order to ensure transparent terms, we feel that the scheme and the DFSPs should all be using a shared disclosure methodology. And we're going to show you what we think that looks like in just a moment. Let's unpack it for just a second. That all the DFSPs would use the same methodology, same framework in order to disclose, provide to the end users, again, prior to them confirming that the transaction should go forward. And this disclosure is going to lay out the terms of the transaction in a methodological or very straightforward way, in that everybody is going to use it. So, if I'm a DFSP and Joanna is and Simeon is, we're all going to be presenting our fees to end users in the same way and using the same methodology. So they'll be able to really make, at least what we call in the United States, apples to apples comparisons. They'll be able to compare, the fruit equally, right? So we know exactly what we're getting. And it has to be in a simple, easy to understand way. And of course, there'll be an education role as we introduce this, because we don't see a fully standardized way of presenting costs to consumers in place in any market that we are aware of. As Joanna had mentioned, there has been a lot of focus on lowering the costs of the transaction fee. And fees are often reported sometimes as a percentage of the amount sent. But we don't actually, it's foreign exchange that has not really been brought into this equation. And that's what we think should really change going forward. Let's bring foreign exchange into that. Thank you, Joanna. You can go ahead. So how do we do that? The key building block in doing that is to ensure that those rates are reported to end users using a benchmark foreign exchange rate. So this is about reporting. And so each scheme probably working with the regulator to ensure that there's a reference or benchmark rate that is suitable for each environment. Of course, that's going to vary based on each currency pair. You know, if there's many jurisdictions in a cross-border scheme, that rate, the benchmark rate will be different for each one. But the central bank sometimes already has this, right? So in those markets, that's relatively easy because the central bank may already require that that is the rate that you know, the DFSPs convert foreign currency at. And where that does not exist, we need to look to the market and validate what rates are out there. We give the example of a Reuters reference rate. You know, that's a common terminology where Reuters puts out what they see as a sort of average benchmark rate for currency pairs. It doesn't have to be that, but we need to find one that is appropriate for each context. So we're going to use this benchmark rate not as the basis of the foreign exchange rate that is being offered to end users, but how we make the calculation. So this is the key difference. And as the asterisk at the bottom of the slide here notes, this is not really in place in markets today, right? We've been focusing on the transaction fee itself. Now we're going to focus in on what is the cost of the foreign exchange to ensure that end users really understand what they're getting and that they're okay with that. So let's go to the next one. And here's where we're really trying to begin to illustrate to anyone that's you know, getting ready to do this, what we mean by this. Obviously, this is an analog representation of what would be shared with end users digitally before they're making a transaction or agree to one. But these are the key informational elements that we want to look for. Amount sent in the sending currency, that's you know, that's pretty self-explanatory. What are the transaction fees end to end, right? Whether or not there's the receiving DFSP is charging something that needs to be calculated into this so that we understand the transaction costs end to end. And in some markets, of course, there may be taxes applied. We want to include that here as well. And then we've got our foreign exchange rate that is applied to the end user. So this is going to be the DFSP's rate, but it needs to be based when it's you know, reported to the end user. It needs to be based or calculated on the basis of the current value of the benchmark FX rate, that reference rate that we mentioned a moment ago. And we're going to show you how we think that that should be calculated in just a moment. So this will give us the amount received, of course, in the receiving currency. The benchmark FX rate here is really for calculation purposes only. It is not, again, requiring that the DFSP or the foreign exchange provider buy that particular rate, but that the rate that is applied and shared with the end user is, if you will, recalculated based on this. It's really just making sure that everyone has the same information for comparing payments. So that gives you the total transaction cost, whether it is a nominal value or a percentage of the amount sent, right? So those are also really kind of standard terms these days. We're just adding the foreign exchange cost into that. And again, this is new and different in a way. Part of it's not new, part of it is. And we know that there may be different preferences in some markets. So we hope to hear from those of you on the call in the future, telling us really how you approach this in your market and what worked and what didn't, right? There may be lots of conversations here, not just with the DFSPs, but also with some end users about what language works for who. So let's go a little bit deeper here. So we're giving you two examples on this standardized disclosure. So we have, again, how it would look in our boxes, provider 1 and provider 2. And they're sending the same amount, right? But the first one, provider 1, is offering, they're charging a transaction fee. Again, not unusual. They do provide a service. The second one is not. It's a 0 transaction fee. And, that's well and good as long as in the end, it turns out to be cheaper for the end user. We would think that it would be a very inclusive result. Unfortunately, what we see in these two examples that we're looking at here is that the 0 fee provider on the right, it ended up being more costly to the end user, right? And how was that? And we need to go back to the FX rate applied, the actual rate that it is converted at. And we see that the provider 2 was actually offering a less advantageous rate for the end user, right? So they're making up for their so-called 0 fee, if you will. So the total transaction cost ends up being greater, higher, in provider 2 example. And, an end user may not always be in a easy position to compare because they maybe only have one DFSP, provider 1 or 2, but sometimes they will be. And some governments around the world, I think Mexico is one of those examples, are also putting up government, consumer protection portals that have a cross-border remittance aspect to them, and they will report these rates to consumers that want to become more educated through here. So we have one more example. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to go into all the details here. Next slide. Thank you, Joanna. And so this is just to show you how the disclosure that we're recommending is calculated itself, right? So giving you some formulas here. When the paper comes out on the very exciting new level 1 website that's coming soon, it will also have an accompanying Excel model. So you'll be able to play around with this disclosure in your market with different amounts and different rates and sort of see how all of this really plays out. It can also be an educational tool when you're working with DFSPs. So all of this detail will be much easier when you get to when we have the full report. So yes, we have I think this is I believe there's one more after this, but within safe payments, we also want to make sure that tiered KYC, which is of course an important level 1 practice, that we want to make sure that everyone has access to this, right? So that just because you're a tier 0 or tier 1 account holder doesn't mean that you're automatically excluded. We feel that the regulator should make this available under the terms of the domestic arrangement for those same tier users. So if you're tier 1 and you can send a payment up to X value in domestic currency, you should be able to do the same in a cross-border currency, or cross-border context. So just to make sure that everyone's included here. So yeah, Joanna, let's go to the last principle. And this is about, shared services, shared capabilities, and that we want to reiterate in the cross-border context, just as in the domestic context, we believe it makes absolute sense to offer cross-border as a shared service of the scheme, right? When every DFSP goes off and does it on their own, it quickly loses its economic inclusivity here because the costs go up, and we can't have all of these other principles and practices applied. So want to make sure that in the cross-border context, this is also included. And then I think we just have a slide that talks, referring to the full report, the name of it here. And Joanna may have more updated information, but we're hoping in the next, I don't know, next month that the website will make its big debut. It's a nice one.
Yep.
You'll enjoy it.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Our new launch goal strategy is for mid-September. We know August is a tough month. We don't want anyone to miss the launch. So the goal is to have the new website and the updated L1P principles, practices, which ultimately are the same as they have been for the last decade that we have been advocating for them, but in a more organized and also more substantiated presentation with additional guidance. We will be sharing the full report with you after this presentation. I'll ask Simeon to share it with all of you. And again, very much welcome any comments, questions, either as part of this conversation here, or please don't hesitate to reach out to either of us or Miller and Matt.
Awesome. Thank you, Joanna and Elizabeth. And I see some chatter in there, and we've got maybe 3 minutes. Miller, do you have any thoughts you want to voice or that you want to add your voice to?
Yeah, thank you. I guess I will. Michael's asking all the right questions, and thankfully Joanna is quick with the answer for one, which is we don't actually know the answer, Michael, as to whether people will, I'll say, misunderstand the benchmark rate as though it were a price. It's not a price. The benchmark rate is the comparable economic value of the currencies in two markets, a currency pair. But it's not itself a rate that anybody can buy. That's not its purpose. It's used by central banks for monetary policy, but it does explain the economic value in those two currencies between those two markets. And it's not a secret that they're widely and openly published. And in some markets, I'm thinking of Nigeria in particular, there is a mandated exchange rate that is the official rate for the country. That's the one we would recommend that they use. If there isn't a benchmark rate for a particular currency pair, then our guidance is the one should be created by the scheme using whatever strategy they'd like to use that has a relatively slow moving but reasonably accurate representation of the paired economic value between those currencies. And then it is fully open to market competition for what price is set for doing this, and whether they set the price by markup to FX or whether they set their price in cost, in actual fees. Matt and I have an opinion that we're going to test, which is that the best way to do this is to get the best rate possible and use that as the price. And if you're going to charge something for the service, put it in the fees. That's the most open and transparent way to sell something. It's not to hide it in the markup, but it actually put it out in the cost directly. And there will be obviously a ton of pushback for people that want to operate differently, some of them shady, some of them much more open about what they're doing. But we believe that the full transparency is the way that end users are empowered in this.
And Michael has his hand up, Simeon.
Michael, go ahead. I'll give you a minute.
Thank you. I think I appreciate what you're saying, Miller. My worry, I suppose, is that I think one of the things that happens at the moment is that costs are, and indeed profits, are loaded into the exchange rate rather than costs, so that essentially people see an exchange rate, which is, as you rightly say, nowhere near the benchmark exchange rate. Now, it may be true that it's a good thing to squeeze profits out of the exchange rate and into charges. But as long as the charges, I mean, I'm looking now at the example that Joanna is kindly showing, as long as the charges don't differentiate between currency conversion charges and general payment processing charges, then essentially it seems to me the foreign exchange providers still have a way of disguising what the actual cost of currency conversion is.
Not really, because the FX rate applied is fully disclosed. The benchmark rate is fully disclosed. I can look at them and see that there's a spread on provider 2 that's wider than the spread on provider 1. So I can just look at them and see that that's true. However, to your point more directly, Elizabeth's original design for this included, and we've left it in as an optional disclosure, which is the actual FX markup rate using that benchmark rate. We're not sure that putting that in the disclosure is necessary. It's something we considered. I don't think it rises to level of a mandate because we've provided you the information that you need to make an economic value judgment on the value of those two currencies as though you were buying Twinkies or widgets and not getting distracted by these calculations. But I hear you, and we don't know the answer, so we do have to do focus studies, and they can A/B test this, putting in the FX markup disclosure line, leaving it out, changing the way in which this is presented. Those things I think are UI conversations that we would want to leave to the providers, as long as the scheme says, yeah, but you have to put all this information there so that anyone can make this calculation on their own. But I think, as Joanna said up front, this is an analog form of the disclosure. I don't think we'd ever put this exactly as you see it here in front of an end user. I don't think they would quite understand it this way. I hope that gets at it, but obviously this is a pretty early stab at this, and it definitely has to be, circulated to regulators, scheme providers, and also to the black market currency providers. The regular currency providers.
Yeah, informal currency providers, I think.
Yes.
Can I ask a supplementary question then? I think there's a general impression, one which I certainly share, that payer institutions undertaking currency conversion themselves drives prices up. It's one of the things that is frequently said. When you try and make a payment using an institution, if that institution can perform the currency conversion itself, then it will, and it will never give you an alternative. Now, I think one of the things that's implied in currency conversion as a service is that we want to stop that practice, and that we want to split off the provision of currency conversion functionality from the provision of payments functionality. Is that correct?
So I'm going to jump in quickly and say absolutely, and that is a hole in this report. If I go to a hotel, which I do frequently, visiting a country that is not my own, they always offer it, whether or not I should pay my bill in the local currency or should I pay the bill in US dollars. They would love me to select US dollars so they can make the conversion themselves. I always select local currency and allow my financial institution to do what they do best and let the hotel stick to hoteling. But I also take note of what they would have charged me, and I do the calculation myself, and I can confirm that they're not as efficient as my bank in almost all cases. So I agree with you, Michael, and I think there might be guidance here that flows into the scheme that says something towards the regulator, that choice at least must be available for merchant payments, where an end user is essentially contextualizing the foreign exchange, but not doing a remittance, because we believe that's a huge unlock for this, and that there may be other requirements that have to flow from that. I would love it if people read this report and put that kind of additional thinking on it. Like, what is missing here? What other guidance should we be providing? So I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Awesome. Because of time, John, Elizabeth, do you guys want to give your final comments?
I think just thank you for the opportunity to share this. We know, again, we just scratched the surface, but hopefully this just gets you excited to see the full report, which we will share shortly. And thank you again for the feedback and the questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Joanna. We will be posting a link to the report, actually the actual whole report on Slack right after this. So please watch out for that.